Tonight, the USS Gerald R. Ford carrier strike group is in the Mediterranean Sea, headed toward the Middle East. The strike group was spotted off the coast of Gibraltar yesterday. And it is joining a significant buildup of U.S. military assets as the president weighs his options for possible military action against Iran. Those could range from limited targeted strikes to sustained operations that could last weeks. A source telling CNN U.S. forces have not been given a target list. CNN Global Affairs analyst Brett McGurk is joining us now. He served in senior national security posts under the last 4 presidents, including President Trump. He also led negotiations with Iran and helped coordinate military operations in that region, giving him obviously a lot of firsthand experience in this area, Brett, and an ideal person to be talking to right now about this.
Sure.
President Trump has urged Iran to make a deal. There's been a lot of talk about what that deal might look like. There have been these discussions, but clearly the president keeping his options open. I'm curious how we got here and where you think this is headed.
Well, Jessica, it's great to be here in what is likely to be a very decisive week here in the Middle East and with Iran. Look, we all hope diplomacy can succeed here, but I'm fairly skeptical that it can. And I'll say why, because you got to ask the key question that you just asked: how did we actually get here? You know, 3 issues used to be somewhat discrete, and they've now converged. So take Iranian missiles, the protests and the crackdown, and then the nuclear issue. Heading into this year, Iran was reproliferating its missile program, and I think it was more likely than not we were going to see Israeli strikes at some point against that program, because Israel is not going to allow those stockpiles to increase. That would not have necessarily drawn in the United States, but that was probably coming. Where the United States got drawn into this was the protests, which began late last year and into January, and then President Trump's warning to Ayatollah Khamenei, the supreme leader, not to violently crack down. And then the supreme leader made, I think, a very grave decision to crack down violently, and President Trump yesterday put the number of dead Iranians in the protests at 32,000. That's a number he used. I can't confirm that, but we know it's in the multiple thousands. So that is what led to the military, U.S. military forces moving and converging into the Middle East. I think we have to keep that in mind as we think of where we're going. Now, the nuclear issue, which was not really front and center first quarter of this year, is so now because Iran has said, as they've always done over many years, and I've dealt with them for many years, they will only talk to the Americans about 2 issues: the nuclear issues and sanctions, and hostages, when they take American hostages. So, and again, they've cabined these negotiations into that nuclear file, and that's what the talks are about. But you add this all together, Jessica, maybe there will be a deal on the nuclear issue. Maybe. Again, think it's unlikely, and we can talk about why. But then you have these other issues. And as I look at President Trump's options, I'm hearing some talk about a limited operation. I think that's very difficult. And again, I'll break down why. And these 3 issues converge. Any operation, Jessica, I think military planners will want to, in the first wave of strikes, target the missiles, the missile launchers in particular, which is a key resource that you have to try to take out, because that degrades and deters Iran's ability to respond to any attack. Then I think U.S. military planners will want to probably restrike some of the Iranian nuclear targets that might be left. And there's actually a new facility. There's a facility buried into a mountain south of Natanz, which was an enrichment center that Iran declared in 2020 that would be a centrifuge manufacturing facility. That is under construction. That might be on the target list. But then finally, and this gets back to what precipitated this crisis, given President Trump's warnings and given the scale of the crackdown, I would suspect the U.S. would also strike targets related to the repressive apparatus of the Iranian regime, the Revolutionary Guards Corps, the besieged militia. So then you're talking about a fairly significant operation that is going to last some time, days, if not weeks, and that seems to be right now where this is heading.
You mentioned you don't think diplomacy is going to succeed here, and why do you think that?
Well, I've done these talks with the Iranians, Jessica, on the nuclear file. It's a very complex subject matter, and Iran always demands, in exchange for any steps on the nuclear side, massive sanctions relief. You know, one reason in the Biden administration we did not kind of get to a nuclear deal is because Iran demanded such extensive sanctions relief and never came off that, and we just didn't agree to do that. For example, we were not going to lift sanctions on the Revolutionary Guards Corps, which is responsible for their terrorism and attacks against Americans. So I have a hard time seeing here the Trump administration granting significant sanctions relief, which I think Iran will demand. And even more complicated is that the UN has acted last fall to put the nuclear program back under Chapter 7 sanctions and the missile programs. That's another layer of complexity. So given the time frame, and given that what I'm seeing from Iran, despite some of their public statements from their foreign minister, they seem to be treating this negotiation very similarly to as they might have done 2, 3, 4, 5 years ago, not fully recognizing the game has really fundamentally changed. So I'm looking at the calendar, Jessica, I'm looking at the extent of these deployments, the kind of meandering pace of the negotiations, and what Iran is saying, which is very similar to their past positions, and it's hard to see a deal coming together. I hope that Iran comes in this week with a new proposal that is significantly different, that perhaps gets rid of their enrichment program, which is really the crux of the matter. But again, I don't see that in the cards right now.
Yeah, and you mentioned the game has changed. Obviously, Iran is at the weakest we've seen it maybe in a generation, I think you could argue, for all the events of the last couple of years. And we have this incredible U.S. military buildup, which I'd love for you to categorize for people, just how large this is and how big it is. And in doing so, my question to you is also, if we did go ahead with these strikes, if the U.S. did, what's your best assessment of the day after and the impact inside Iran and with the country's leaders?
Well, it's the key question. What makes this situation so different than any other military operation that President Trump, in his role as commander-in-chief in his first term or second term, may have ordered, this is really fundamentally different. This is not a kind of discrete mission such as the operation that just captured Nicolas Maduro, such as Midnight Hammer, the one-night strikes that struck Iranian nuclear facilities, the strike against Qasem Soleimani, one of Iran's leaders back in 2020, or even President Trump's strikes into Syria after the Syrian leader used chemical weapons against his own people. Those are all kind of very discrete, very clear missions. Here, it's much more open-ended for the reasons I stated. You can't just go in and do one night of strikes, because I think you have to target the missiles and these other elements within the country. And that is why I think, Jessica, you've seen this massive deployment. It's a deployment on scale that I have really not seen in decades, and it is an operational deployment. If you really study it, all the elements you would need for a significant kind of multi-day, even an operation that might last weeks, is all getting into place. That does not mean the president will necessarily order that campaign to begin, but it seems like that's where we're heading, and it's really uncertain. You know, one of the great military theorists from the 19th century, Karl von Clausewitz, who studied anyone who studies strategy, says that before a political leader in a commander-in-chief role like a president orders military action, he has to be clear in his mind of what he wants to achieve and how to achieve it. And here the objectives still remain unclear. But to get a sense of them, I go back to how this crisis began. It was the protests. And I don't think we can lose sight of that. The Iranians are trying to focus only on the nuclear. It was the protests and that crackdown. And then if you're talking about military actions against Iran, you have to take into account the missiles. That's how this expands. And if you don't have your objectives very clear going in, as events unfold in the course of an operation, your objectives can be defined for you. That's how you get into mission creep scenarios. So a lot of uncertainty here, Jessica. In a very decisive week, we'll have Iran coming in with a diplomatic proposal, the State of the Union address on Tuesday, and I think we'll know a little bit more here by the end of the week.
A wonderful context for all of us, as you mentioned, in a very uncertain time and what will likely be a very important week. Brett McGurk, thank you so much. Good to see you.